Welcome. This podcast is an introduction to reading assessment. The podcast has 4 goals: to identify purposes of assessment, to identify approaches to assessment, to identify methods for assessing reading, and to identify appropriate conditions and accommodations for assessment. The podcast is organized into 4 sections to help us address these 4 goals. Part 1, Purposes of Assessment. Despite the negative connotations of assessment due to the heavy emphasis in recent years on high-stakes testing, assessment plays a critical role in education decision-making. Fortunately, assessment can take several forms. Informal standardized tests are just one of those. Assessment can also take the form of a teacher-made test, or a teacher's observation of student academic performance. Selection of a specific assessment method and instrument should be made only after considering the purpose of the assessment. The most common purposes for assessment include screening, diagnosis, progress monitoring, and outcome measurement. We'll discuss each of these. A screen serves as a filter to let some things through and keep other things out. A screening assessment can be thought of as the filter that separates those students who are achieving as expected from those who are struggling. It lets through students who don't need help and catches those who might need help. Selecting the right screening tool is important to ensure that the test catches the right students. Typically, screening is conducted with all students at the beginning of each school year and as new students enter a school throughout the year. Screening assessments are usually brief measures that give teachers a general idea about students' abilities. Once a student has been identified through screening as likely to need help, additional information about the nature of the student's needs is collected using diagnostic assessment. Through diagnosis, the assessor conducts a detailed examination of a student's strengths and weaknesses. Diagnostic assessment requires a knowledgeable and skilled assessor because the process typically requires interpretation of test results from several sources. The ability to synthesize data from different tests is essential. Once diagnostic assessment data are collected and analyzed, planning for intervention can take place. Once instruction or intervention begins, frequent ongoing assessment can provide the teacher with information about the effectiveness of the intervention. This progress monitoring assessment should be conducted on a regular schedule using equivalent measures so that comparisons may be drawn over time. Teachers may also use informal observation of a student's learning to measure progress within a lesson. When relying on observations for progress monitoring, some form of documentation is needed to use later for instructional decision-making. Progress monitoring assessment may be used to estimate rates of improvement, identify children who are not making adequate progress and therefore require additional or different forms of instruction, and compare the efficacy of different forms of instruction. Continual progress monitoring assessment may be used to design more effective instruction. Good teachers assess their students' learning during a lesson and use the information to decide what to do next. A teacher might reteach the lesson, review a concept, or choose a different instructional method to ensure that the student learns. The best teachers understand that something has not really been taught until the student has learned it. Only through assessment can the teacher be certain that the student has learned. Outcome assessment is used to determine whether students have achieved expected levels of performance after a given period of time. These assessments are usually conducted once each year to measure mastery of grade-level objectives. Classrooms, schools, districts, and states are compared using the results of outcome assessments. Outcome measurement is sometimes used to make high-stakes decisions, such as whether a student should be promoted to the next grade or whether a school's funding should be increased or decreased. At this point, you should be able to explain each of the 4 main purposes of assessment. Pause the video now to take notes and play back any of the previous section that you need to review. Then continue when you're ready to move on to the next section. Part 2, Approaches to Assessment. All assessment can be classified into 2 categories, formative and summative. Both involve collecting, synthesizing, and interpreting data, but they're used for different purposes. Formative assessments are used to make decisions to improve learning or teaching. Summative assessments are used to evaluate the effectiveness of those decisions for the purpose of determining the extent of student learning and assigning grades. Formative assessment can be considered assessment for learning, and summative assessment can be considered assessment of learning. Assessment can also be classified as either formal or informal. Formal methods are generally published, standardized tests that have been evaluated to ensure validity and reliability. Informal methods are generally techniques that a knowledgeable teacher can employ with or without the use of published materials. Assessment can also be group administered or individually administered. Group administered tests allow the teacher to gather a large amount of data in a short amount of time. However, tests that are administered in a group setting assume that all students understand the directions, and they assume that the responses accurately represent the student's abilities. Individually administering tests allows for the assessor to use more than just the student's responses to interpret the results. Often, observations made during the assessment yield important information that is just as important and useful as the student's responses. Seeing the process the student uses to answer questions can help the teacher understand better how to help the student overcome difficulties. Individually administered assessments take far longer to administer and interpret, but the results may be more useful. Generally, screening, progress monitoring, and outcome measures can be group administered or individually administered, but diagnosis is almost always accomplished through individually administered assessment. Standardized tests of achievement are used to measure a student's performance in a given area in a way that can be considered both reliable and valid. Reliability refers to the consistency or stability of scores from a given test. Validity is the extent to which an assessment measures what it is intended to measure. Standardized measures have uniform methods for administration and scoring. Norm-referenced assessments compare an individual's score to a normative group of the same age or grade level. Criterion-referenced assessments compare an individual student's performance to a criterion or benchmark. Norm-referenced tests typically yield a standard score or percentile rank, while criterion-referenced tests classify a student based on how close the student's score is to the established benchmark. Scores on standardized tests can take many forms. Most tests yield numerical scores that are interpreted based on comparison to either an established criterion or a normal distribution or bell curve. Understanding the different types of scores is necessary for accurate interpretation of test results. Most teachers rely far more on informal assessment than formal assessment to make day-to-day instructional decisions. The teacher sets long-term goals for students and determines the appropriate scope and sequence of instruction and specific criteria for mastery. Measurement of progress toward mastery can be accomplished with criterion-based assessments. One especially effective way of measuring individual students' progress is through curriculum-based measurement, or CBM. The focus of CBM is to monitor the effectiveness of instruction. If a teacher determines through CBM that a student is not making adequate progress, the next step would be to examine the instruction to determine what alteration may be made to promote better student learning. At this point, you should understand the uses of formal and informal assessment, group and individually administered assessments, norm and criterion-referenced assessment, and curriculum-based measurement. Pause the video now to take notes and play back any of the previous section that you might still need to review. Then continue when you're ready to move on to the next section. Part 3, Methods for Classroom Reading Assessment. An informal reading inventory, or IRI, can provide an overall picture of a student's reading ability and in-depth information about the student's reading comprehension. An IRI can be teacher-constructed, but many IRIs are commercially available. Most IRIs provide graded word lists, graded passages for students to read aloud, and questions for the teacher to ask. There are many instances in which a teacher may find it more appropriate to design an assessment tool to address a specific need. It's important to design the assessment carefully to ensure validity. That is, are you measuring what you think you're measuring? It's important also to develop a systematic approach to administration of the measure. Systematic observation of student performance can be one of the most useful and powerful forms of assessment, and also one of the most convenient. because observations can be conducted any time that the student is performing the task. If there are varying degrees of skill mastery possible, then a rubric can help the teacher systematically measure the quality of the student's work. Using a rubric identifies the extent to which criteria have been reached and provides feedback to students about how they can improve. A teacher may also elect to keep anecdotal records of a student's performance. This approach involves writing a narrative account of the student's performance for either immediate or subsequent evaluation. The most common method of assessment in most classrooms is questioning from the teacher. Effective teachers ask questions that promote student thinking, and they carefully select questions that will evaluate students' mastery of lesson objectives. Collecting and systematically analyzing authentic examples of work is known as portfolio assessment. Although portfolios offer a valuable, holistic option for evaluating student performance, they are difficult to use for daily instructional decision-making because they are seldom sensitive to growth over a short period of time. At this point, you should understand the uses of various informal methods of reading assessment, including informal reading inventories, teacher-made tools, teacher observations and anecdotal records, teacher questioning, and portfolio assessment. Pause the video now to take notes and play back any of the previous section that you still need to review. Continue when you're ready to move on to the next section. Part 4. Appropriate conditions and accommodations for assessment. It's important to select tests that are usable. For example, is the time required to complete the test reasonable? Will you get valuable information for the time invested? Can it be administered in the settings you have available? Are the directions clear for both the teacher and the student? Is the test culturally sensitive? Once you've selected an appropriate instrument, it's important to follow the test directions very carefully to ensure that your results are accurate and useful. Test results are only useful if they are an accurate reflection of what a student knows or can do. The conditions under which students are tested can have an effect on their test performance. For example, testing should take place in a quiet, well-lit room with adequate ventilation. If the testing environment is too noisy or too dark, too warm or too cold, students' concentration will suffer, and their performance may be adversely affected. To measure what a student is capable of, removing distractions is essential. Still, measuring performance with normal classroom distractions can present useful information about how the student can function in a classroom setting. It's important, however, that the assessor remains aware of distractions and considers their impact on performance when interpreting test results. A student with a disability may be entitled to specific accommodations on test if the nature of the disability warrants them. An accommodation does not alter or lower the standards or expectation for a subject or test. Accommodations may include extended testing time, an alternative testing schedule. For example, a test may be broken into small segments and administered over several sittings. An alternative setting, generally one free of distractions. Or an alternative testing format. For example, items may be read aloud to a student. The student may respond orally, or a scribe may record the student's answers. These accommodations apply to all testing situations with reasonable restrictions. For example, a student may not have a reading comprehension test read aloud because it would render the test invalid by making it a measure of listening comprehension rather than reading comprehension. Decisions about accommodations should be made as part of a student's individualized education program or 504 plan. Accommodations are different from modifications. While accommodations are designed to help students access the general curriculum or meet regular requirements, modifications involve changing the requirements or changing the curriculum itself. For example, an assessment modification might be testing a student on 10 spelling words when everyone else in the class is tested on 20, or expecting the student to write only one paragraph when other students are expected to write 3. A teacher may elect to assess a child's reading fluency using a passage on his reading level rather than on his grade level. Modifications are often necessary and appropriate, but the decision to make modifications rather than accommodations should be made thoughtfully. Modifying the standards may have long-term consequences for students. Pause here to think about the content addressed in this podcast and to review anything you may have missed. We hope that this podcast has helped you better understand reading assessment. Thank you for watching.